Few entertainers have ever managed to burrow so deeply into the hearts of an entire generation the way Pee-wee Herman did. That gap-toothed grin, the too-tight gray suit, the infectious cackle that somehow made every single person in the room feel like a child again. For millions of kids growing up in the 80s, Saturday mornings were not complete without Pee-wee's The Playhouse lighting up the television screen. He was not just a character. He was a ritual. A comfort. A strange, colorful corner of childhood that felt completely safe, completely innocent, and completely unforgettable. But here is the thing about carefully constructed images. They are exactly that. Constructed. And behind every perfectly polished public persona, there is a private world that the cameras never captured, that the fan mail never reached, and that the award ceremonies never acknowledged. For Paul Reubens, the man who spent decades hiding inside Pee-wee Herman's costume, that private world was darker, more complicated, and more tragic than anyone watching Saturday morning cartoons could have ever imagined. Paul Reubens died on July 30, 2023, after a private battle with cancer that he had concealed from almost everyone around him. Even in death, he was keeping secrets. The entertainment world paused. Tributes flooded in. Celebrities shared their memories. Fans posted childhood photographs next to their television sets, remembering the joy that Pee-wee had brought them. And for a brief moment, it seemed like the world would remember him only for the laughter, only for the creativity, only for the 15 Emmy Awards and the Hollywood Walk of Fame star in the Tim Burton film that became a cult classic. But grief has a short memory, and the internet never forgets. Within days of his passing, the conversations shifted. Old headlines resurfaced. Court documents circulated. And millions of people who had grown up loving Pee-wee Herman was suddenly confronted with a question that nobody wanted to ask out loud. Who was Paul Reubens really? Not the character. Not the costume. Not the constructed, carefully maintained public image that had been decades in the making. But the actual man living behind all of it. Today, we are going to answer that question honestly, completely, and without looking away from the parts that are difficult. Because Paul Reubens was not simply a villain, and he was not simply a victim. He was something far more complicated than either of those labels. And his story, the full story, deserves to be told. What you are about to hear will change the way you remember Saturday mornings forever. To understand how Paul Reubens fell so far, you first have to understand how high he climbed, and more importantly, how desperately he had to fight just to begin the climb at all. Because the origin of Pee-wee Herman is not a story about overnight success. It is a story about a deeply awkward, intensely creative young man who could not quite figure out where he belonged in the world and who eventually solved that problem by inventing an entirely new world of his own. Paul Reubens was born in Peekskill, New York, in 1952, but he grew up in Sarasota, Florida, surrounded by the color and spectacle of circus culture. His father flew planes. His mother taught school. And somewhere between discipline and creativity, young Paul developed an obsession with performance that never left him. He was the kid who was always on, always performing, always searching for the laugh or the reaction or the moment of pure theatrical magic that made him feel alive in a way that nothing else could. After high school, he pursued acting with the kind of single-minded determination that either produces greatness or destroys a person completely. He auditioned for Juilliard and did not get in. That rejection, which would have stopped most people, only pushed him further. He found his way to the Groundlings, the legendary improvisational comedy troupe in Los Angeles, and it was there, inside that experimental, boundary-pushing creative space, that something unexpected happened. Pee-wee Herman was born. The character emerged during a 1978 improv exercise, and from the very beginning, he was a contradiction. Childlike but knowing. Innocent but loaded with subtle adult undertones that flew straight over the heads of younger audiences while landing perfectly with everyone else. Reubens had created something genuinely rare, a character that operated on two completely different levels simultaneously, delighting children with pure whimsy while quietly winking at every adult in the room. What is crucial to understand here, and what most people miss entirely when they tell this story, is that Pee-wee Herman was never meant to be a children's character. The original act was edgy, adult-orientated, and performed in clubs where the audience was drinking, not eating cereal. The sweetness came later. The Saturday morning television version of Pee-wee was a deliberate evolution, a conscious decision to broaden the audience and capture something bigger. But the original DNA of the character, that strange tension between innocence and something far less innocent, never fully disappeared. It was always there, threaded through everything, waiting. By the mid-80s, Paul Reubens had achieved something that very few entertainers ever truly accomplish. He had not just become famous. He had become iconic. Pee-wee's Big Adventure, released in 1985 and directed by a then little-known filmmaker named Tim Burton, was a critical and commercial triumph that announced Peewee Herman to the entire world in a way that the stage shows and club performances never could. The film was bizarre, funny, visually inventive, and completely unlike anything else playing in theaters at the time. Audiences did not know what to make of it at first. Then they fell completely in love with it. The television show followed in 1986, and Pee-wee's Playhouse quickly became one of the most talked about programs on Saturday morning television. But calling it a children's show almost feels reductive, because what Reubens built was something far more ambitious than that label suggests. The production budget rivaled prime-time sitcoms. The writing was layered with jokes that existed on multiple frequencies. The set design was surreal and overwhelming and unlike anything children's television had ever attempted. It won 15 Emmy Awards. 15. For a Saturday morning cartoon block. That number alone tells you everything you need to know about the level at which Paul Reubens was operating. And yet, even at the absolute peak of his success, something was quietly wrong beneath the surface. People who worked closely with Reubens during this period have since described a man who was increasingly difficult to separate from his creation. He refused, almost obsessively, to be photographed or interviewed outside of the Pee-wee Herman character. Public appearances required the full costume, the full makeup, and the full performance. There was no Paul Reubens available for comment. There was only Pee-wee. Always only Pee-wee. On the surface, this looked like brilliant marketing. Protect the mystique. Keep the character alive. Never let the audience see behind the curtain. And in many ways, it was exactly that. But it was also something else entirely. It was a man disappearing into a costume because the costume felt safer than his own skin. It was a man using a fictional character as armor against a world he was not entirely sure how to navigate without it. The lines between Paul Reubens and Pee-wee Herman were not just blurred. For long stretches of time, they were completely erased. This is the detail that makes everything that came next so much more devastating. Because when the scandal arrived, and it arrived without warning and without mercy, it did not just destroy a career. It destroyed the only identity Paul Reubens had allowed himself to have for nearly a decade. And that kind of destruction leaves marks that even the most determined comeback cannot fully erase. July 26, 1991. That is the date everything collapsed. Paul Reubens was arrested at an adult movie theater in Sarasota, Florida, the same city where he had grown up, the same city where his imagination had first caught fire, surrounded by circus lights and theatrical magic. The charge was indecent exposure. The details were tabloid gold. And within 48 hours, the story had consumed every major news outlet in the country, spreading with the kind of velocity that only the most shocking celebrity scandals ever achieve. The reaction from the entertainment industry was immediate and devastating. Networks did not hesitate. Reruns of Pee-wee's Playhouses were pulled from schedules overnight. Endorsement deals evaporated. Projects that had been in development were quietly shelved. The blacklisting was not gradual or negotiated. It was total, and it was instant. One arrest, in one theater, in one Florida city, and a career that had taken 15 years to build was dismantled in a matter of days. The entertainment industry, which had celebrated Paul Reubens with Emmy Awards and standing ovations, turned its back without a second glance. What made the public reaction so particularly brutal was the nature of the character at the center of it all. If this had happened to an action star or a dramatic actor, the scandal would have been damaging. But Peewee Herman was a children's icon. He was the man millions of parents had trusted to sit with their kids every Saturday morning. He was associated with innocence in the most fundamental way possible. And that association, which had been the source of all his success, now became the source of all his destruction. The higher the pedestal, the more catastrophic the fall. There were voices of support, scattered but genuine. Fellow entertainers and devoted fans argued that the reaction was wildly disproportionate to the actual offense. Protests were held in places like New York's Greenwich Village, where supporters rallied behind Reubens and challenged the media's framing of the story. Some pointed out, reasonably, that the incident had involved no direct victims in any traditional sense and that the public shaming felt less like justice and more like spectacle. These were fair points. But fair points rarely survive contact with a fully ignited media frenzy. Paul Reubens entered a period of near total silence following the arrest. The man who had performed at Carnegie Hall, who had appeared alongside Cher, who had built one of the most recognizable characters in American entertainment history, was suddenly nowhere. And in that silence, without the costume and without the character to hide behind, he was forced to confront something he had been successfully avoiding for years. Himself. Just himself. Stripped of everything that had made him feel safe, and completely alone with whoever Paul Reubens actually was underneath all of it. The 1991 arrest was devastating. But what came a decade later was something else entirely. Something darker, more complex, and far more difficult to defend or contextualize or explain away with arguments about proportionality and media hysteria. In 2001, law enforcement raided Paul Reubens' Los Angeles home following a tip received by the police department. What they found inside that house would permanently redefine how the world understood the man behind Pee-wee Herman and would close doors that the 1991 scandal had only partially shut. Officers seized more than 30,000 items from the property. Among the collected materials were photographs and vintage films that depicted minors in explicit situations. The sheer volume of what was found was staggering on its own. But it was the nature of the content that truly silenced even Reubens' most loyal defenders. This was not a moment of poor judgment in a public theater. This was a private collection, assembled deliberately over time, hidden carefully inside the home of a man who had spent his entire career being trusted by children and their parents. The legal process that followed was long, complicated, and deliberately obscured from public view. Court documents were classified under unusually high security restrictions, limiting what journalists and ordinary citizens could access. Reubens' defense, led by prominent celebrity attorney Blair Burke, argued technicalities surrounding statutes of limitations and attempted to frame portions of the collection as historical erotic art rather than criminal material. These arguments were sophisticated and legally strategic. They were also, for millions of people watching from the outside, deeply unconvincing. A plea agreement was eventually reached. One count was dropped in 2004. Remaining charges were dismissed in 2007 under California provisions available to petitioners who had completed their sentences. But the admission embedded within that agreement was impossible to minimize or reframe. Reubens acknowledged possession of at least 170 images of minors with exposed genitalia and was required to register as an explicit offender. Whatever legal maneuvering had softened the formal consequences, that acknowledgement existed in the public record permanently, and no amount of carefully worded statements could remove it. What followed was not forgiveness. It was not redemption. It was something quieter and more ambiguous than either of those things. Reubens continued to exist at the edges of the entertainment world, appearing occasionally in small film roles and making sporadic public appearances, never fully disappearing but never fully returning either. He existed in a strange middle space between cautionary tale and forgotten footnote, between the beloved icon he had once been and the uncomfortable truth of who he had turned out to be. He died in that middle space on July 30, 2023, privately, quietly, still carrying secrets, still complicated, and still impossible to reduce to a single clean narrative. And that is exactly what makes his story worth telling completely, because the truth, however uncomfortable, always matters more than the version we wish were true.